Billionaire stories. The luxury car dealership's showroom lights gleamed against Marcus Sterling's midnight blue Lamborghini as he adjusted the designer watch on his wrist. At 34, he'd built a tech empire worth billions. His name synonymous with innovation and ruthless efficiency. Tall, with carefully styled dark hair and intense hazel eyes that missed nothing in boardrooms, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd conquered every challenge life had thrown his way. His penthouse garage was immaculate, everything in its place just like his life. Organized, predictable, controlled. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Dinner with venture capitalists, then back to review expansion plans. The same precise rhythm that had made him a legend in Silicon Valley. His phone buzzed against the leather dashboard. Marcus glanced at the screen, ready to dismiss whatever minor crisis his assistant was managing. But the name that appeared made his hand freeze halfway to the gear shift. Emma Rodriguez. The woman he'd walked away from 13 months ago. The woman whose smile used to light up rooms he didn't even know felt dark. The woman he'd convinced himself he was better off without because she wanted things he couldn't give: time, attention, presence. Marcus stared at that name, his thumb hovering over the decline button. Emma had never called him after they ended things. Not once. She had too much pride. One of the things that had drawn him to her, and one of the reasons they could never bridge the gap his ambitions created. Against every logical instinct screaming in his head, he answered. Marcus. Her voice came through, softer than he remembered, carrying a weight that made something in his chest constrict unexpectedly. Emma, I know this is the last thing you expected. There was something different, something that made every muscle in his body tense. Not anger, not desperation, but a quiet exhaustion that spoke of battles fought alone. I wouldn't call if I had any other choice. In the background, barely audible, came a sound that didn't belong in any conversation they'd ever had. A soft, irregular crying that made his blood run cold and his heart start pounding. Emma, what's? I need to see you, she said quickly, the words tumbling out like she'd rehearsed them 1,000 times, but they still hurt to say. Please, Marcus. Can you come? Marcus turned off the engine without thinking about it. The garage fell silent except for the cooling metal and the thundering of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Where are you? She gave him an address in Riverside, somewhere he didn't recognize. Far from the downtown luxury where she used to spend weekends with him. Far from anywhere their lives had ever intersected. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he heard himself say, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Marcus. Emma's voice cracked just slightly, revealing vulnerability she usually kept hidden. Thank you. The line went dead, leaving him alone with questions multiplying faster than he could process them. That crying in the background, the bone-deep exhaustion in her voice, the fact that she'd called him at all after everything. He sat in the Lamborghini for another minute, just staring at his phone like it held answers it couldn't possibly give. The investors would wonder where he was. His carefully planned schedule would be thrown into chaos. There would be consequences to this choice. There always were when Marcus Sterling deviated from his plans. But something in Emma's voice had reached through 13 months of silence and grabbed hold of something he thought he'd buried under ambition and success and the constant drive for more. Please subscribe and like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Marcus walked to his more practical Mercedes, the one that wouldn't scream wealth in whatever neighborhood Emma was calling home now. As he drove through Seattle's evening traffic, past the familiar skyline he'd helped shape with his technology empire, one thought kept circling through his mind like a prayer or a curse. What had happened to Emma Rodriguez in the 13 months since he'd walked away? The address led him to a modest apartment complex where young families made ends meet, and single mothers learned to perform miracles with limited resources. His Mercedes felt obscenely out of place among the practical sedans and aging vehicles, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing through scenarios, none of them good, all of them making his heart pound harder. Emma opened the door before he could knock, like she'd been watching for him through the window. The woman standing before him was recognizably the same Emma Rodriguez he'd fallen for 3 years ago, but everything about her had been refined by exhaustion and something deeper, a strength forged in the fire of surviving completely alone. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in a messy bun, shorter than he remembered, like she'd cut it herself without caring how it looked. Deep shadows circled her green eyes, but they still held that direct gaze that had always made him feel simultaneously seen and stripped bare. She wore simple jeans and a soft gray sweater that hung loose on her frame, and Marcus realized she'd lost weight. The kind that comes from stress eating you alive rather than any intention. "Hi," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him into her world. The apartment was small but spotlessly clean, furnished with pieces that looked like they came from necessity rather than choice. A second-hand couch, a dining table that had seen better decades, but everything arranged with the careful eye Emma had always had for making spaces feel warm despite their limitations. That's when Marcus heard it again. The soft crying from somewhere deeper in the apartment, clearer now, not distressed exactly, just the persistent sound of an infant who needed something only patience and love could provide. Emma caught his expression, saw the confusion and growing dread in his eyes. "That's why I called." She led him down a short hallway to a small bedroom that had been converted into a nursery. The walls were painted a soft yellow, decorated with hand-drawn pictures of animals that Marcus recognized as Emma's work. She'd always been talented with art, could sketch beauty out of nothing. A rocking chair sat in the corner, well-worn from use. And in the simple wooden crib lay a baby, 4 months old, with dark hair and impossibly small fingers that grasped at nothing. And eyes, oh God, those eyes were the same hazel as his own, looking right through him with an intensity that made his chest feel like it was caving in. "Marcus," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with emotion she'd been holding back. "Meet your son." The words hit him like a physical blow, like someone had reached into his chest and grabbed his heart and squeezed. Marcus gripped the edge of the crib, his knuckles white, as everything he thought he knew about the last 13 months crumbled around him like sand castles against the tide. "My what? Would you have answered that call? What do you think Marcus is feeling right now? Drop your thoughts in the comments below." Emma picked up the baby with practiced ease, supporting his head with the automatic precision of someone who'd learned every nuance of infant care through trial and necessity and countless sleepless nights. The crying stopped immediately, replaced by soft gurgling sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence that filled the room. "His name is Liam," she continued, rocking gently with a rhythm that was clearly second nature now. "Liam Marcus Rodriguez. He was born 4 months ago, but he was conceived." She paused, meeting Marcus's eyes directly, unflinching. 13.5 months ago. About 2 weeks before you left for that extended trip to Tokyo." Marcus's mind raced backward, calculating dates, remembering Tokyo. The deal that was supposed to take 2 weeks but stretched into 8. The deal that had been the beginning of the end for them, because Emma had asked him to stay for her birthday, had practically begged, and he'd chosen business instead. He'd chosen a conference room over her tears. "You tried to call me," he said slowly, the memory surfacing like something from underwater. "Multiple times. 19 times over 3 months, Emma confirmed, her voice steady but carrying an ocean of hurt beneath the calm surface. "But you were always in meetings or different time zones or too busy. Your assistant finally told me you'd given specific instructions not to be disturbed, unless it was a genuine emergency." The words cut deeper than any accusation could have. Marcus remembered those instructions, remembered being so focused, so driven, so determined to close the biggest deal of his career that personal calls had seemed like distractions he couldn't afford. He'd been building an empire, and empires required sacrifice. "I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after you left," Emma continued, her voice growing quieter. "By the time I could finally reach you, you were already negotiating the London expansion. I convinced myself you'd made your choice, that bringing a baby into it would just be trapping you with something you never wanted." Marcus stared at Liam, his son, those words still feeling impossible in his mind, taking in every detail. The way his small hand curled around Emma's finger with complete trust. The soft rise and fall of his breathing. The fact that this tiny human being shared his DNA and had been growing and learning and becoming himself for 4 months while Marcus had been completely oblivious, chasing deals that suddenly felt meaningless. "Why didn't you try harder?" The words came out harsher than he intended, defensive. Emma's voice carried no bitterness when she answered, just tired honesty that somehow hurt more. "Marcus, you made it abundantly clear that nothing was more important than your work. I wasn't going to trap you with a baby you didn't ask for, didn't plan for. That wouldn't have been fair to anyone, especially not to Liam. But he's my son. Yes, she said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. He is. Marcus reached out tentatively, his hands shaking slightly, and Emma shifted Liam toward him. The baby was lighter than he'd expected, warm and solid and utterly dependent, and when those hazel eyes focused on his face with serious baby concentration, something fundamental shifted inside Marcus's chest. Not the dramatic revelation he'd seen in movies, but something quieter and more profound, like a door he hadn't known was closed had suddenly opened, letting in light he hadn't realized he'd been living without all this time. "Emma," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, thick with emotions he couldn't name. "What do you need?" She looked at him for a long moment, weighing whether he meant it, whether this was real or just temporary guilt that would fade when the shock wore off. "I need help," she admitted finally, and he could hear what it cost her to say it. "Real help, Marcus. Not just money, though God knows that would make things easier. I need someone who's going to be here consistently, who's going to show up not just when it's convenient. Because I can't do this alone anymore, I'm drowning, and Liam deserves better than a mother who's too exhausted to think straight half the time." Marcus looked down at his son, the words still feeling strange even in his thoughts, and realized that everything he thought mattered 13 months ago had just become completely irrelevant. The Tokyo deal, the London expansion, the board meetings, the empire he built that had seemed so vital just hours ago. None of it mattered more than this. None of it even came close. 3 days later, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. But would it be enough to prove he truly changed? Keep watching to find out. 3 days later, Marcus stood in the baby products aisle of Target, holding a list Emma had written in her careful handwriting, feeling more lost than he had during his first board meeting at 26 when he'd pitched to investors who could have crushed his dreams with a single word. Diapers came in sizes he'd never heard of. Baby formula had more varieties than his investment portfolio. The sheer volume of things a 4-month-old apparently needed was absolutely staggering and overwhelming. He'd started by doing what he always did when faced with a problem: throw money at it until it went away. The apartment now had a top-of-the-line stroller, an organic mattress for Liam's crib, and enough baby supplies to stock a small boutique. But Emma's expression when he'd arrived with the third delivery truck had told him everything he needed to know about how helpful his approach had actually been. "Marcus," she'd said gently, trying not to laugh at his excess, "Liam doesn't need a $60 organic onesie that he'll outgrow in 3 weeks. He needs someone to hold him at 3 in the morning, when he won't stop crying and I'm about to fall apart." Now, standing among shelves of baby products with his phone buzzing constantly with work emergencies he was actively ignoring, Marcus was beginning to understand the difference between providing and being present. His assistant had called 14 times. The London investors were waiting for documents he hadn't even looked at. Board members were asking increasingly pointed questions about his sudden unavailability, his lack of response, his complete radio silence. The empire that had always demanded his complete attention was starting to show cracks from his absence. But every time he thought about leaving Seattle, about getting back to his normal routine, about reclaiming his old life, he remembered Liam's tiny hand wrapped around his finger with complete trust and found himself unable to care about quarterly projections or shareholder value. When he returned to Emma's apartment that evening, weighted down with bags of supplies, she was sitting in the rocking chair with Liam against her shoulder, both of them looking utterly exhausted in a way that made his heart ache. The baby had been fussy all day, she explained, dark circles under her eyes deepening. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since Marcus's first visit, and it was clearly taking its toll. "Let me try," Marcus offered, setting down the bags with careful precision. Emma hesitated, protective instinct warring with desperate need for help. "He's been really particular today, Marcus. I don't think. Please." She transferred Liam to his arms with careful instruction, like she was handing over something infinitely precious and breakable. Marcus settled into the rocking chair, trying to replicate the gentle motion he'd watched her use, but Liam immediately began to cry, his little face scrunching up in displeasure. "Rock slower," Emma suggested, perching on the edge of the couch, too tired to fully relax. "And support his head more." "Yes, just like that." Marcus adjusted his grip, his movements clumsy with unfamiliarity, large hands trying to be gentle. Liam's cries intensified, and Marcus felt a panic he'd never experienced in any business crisis, any hostile takeover, any failed negotiation. In boardrooms, he could command rooms full of executives with a single look. Here, he couldn't even soothe one small baby, and the failure felt crushing. "I'm doing something wrong," he said, frustration and fear creeping into his voice. "You're learning," Emma corrected softly with infinite patience. "There's a difference." She guided his hand to a different position, showed him how to pat Liam's back with just the right rhythm, the exact pressure. Slowly, miraculously, the crying subsided into hiccups, then soft breathing that sounded like contentment. Marcus looked down to find Liam's hazel eyes studying his face with what might have been curiosity or forgiveness or just baby randomness. "There," Emma said softly, smiling despite her exhaustion. "He's getting used to you." They sat in comfortable silence, Emma curled on the couch, Marcus rocking gently with their son. And it was the most peaceful moment he'd experienced in months, maybe years, maybe ever. No notifications demanding immediate response. No urgent calls that couldn't wait. No decisions that would affect thousands of jobs or millions in revenue. Just this small warm weight against his chest and the quiet satisfaction of successfully soothing his child, of being needed for something that actually mattered. "Emma," Marcus said eventually, his voice low to avoid disturbing Liam's peaceful state, "I cancelled the London expansion." Her head snapped up, eyes wide with shock. "What?" "Marcus, no. You don't need to do that." "I do, actually." He met her eyes steadily. "I've spent the last 3 days trying to figure out how to manage everything, how to be in 2 places at once, and I can't. Something has to give. And it's not going to be this, it's not going to be him." Emma stared at him like he'd grown a second head. That deal was worth $300 million. Marcus shifted Liam to his other arm, marveling at how natural the movement was becoming, how right it felt. "But what's the point of building an empire if you miss everything that actually matters? What's the point of having everything if you have nothing that counts?" Do you think Marcus made the right choice? Have you ever had to choose between career and family? Share your story in the comments. Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying him like she was seeing him for the first time. "This isn't temporary guilt, is it? You're not going to wake up next week and realize you've made a terrible mistake and resent us for it." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with history and the memory of all the times his work had come first, all the dinners missed, weekends sacrificed, conversations cut short by urgent calls that had seemed so important at the time but now felt hollow. "Emma," Marcus said, looking down at Liam's peaceful face, then back at her with absolute certainty. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, more than I can count. But being here, choosing this, isn't one of them." Something in her expression softened, the guarded look she'd worn since his first visit, giving way to something more vulnerable, more hopeful. "He missed you today," she said quietly, voice thick with emotion. "When you didn't come by this morning, he kept looking at the door like he was waiting. I think he's getting attached." Marcus felt his chest tighten with an emotion he didn't have a name for. Something bigger than happiness, deeper than satisfaction. "Good," he said, voice rough. "Because so am I." Outside, Seattle's evening traffic hummed past Clara's window, the city continuing its relentless pace, the world moving forward whether they were ready or not. But inside the small apartment, time moved differently, measured not in meetings and deadlines but in gentle breathing and the soft creak of a rocking chair, and the sound of a man discovering what actually mattered. Marcus was learning that the most important deals couldn't be negotiated in boardrooms, or sealed with handshakes or measured in stock prices. They happened in quiet moments like this, built on trust earned one gentle rock at a time. One sleepless night, one small victory over crying and confusion. The emergency board meeting was called for Thursday at 10 in the morning. Marcus sat at the head of the mahogany conference table in his downtown Seattle headquarters, surrounded by faces that had grown increasingly skeptical over the past 2 weeks, expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed anger. His phone lay silent beside his notepad, a choice that would have been absolutely unthinkable a month ago. That phone had been his lifeline, his connection to everything that mattered in his old world. "The London investors pulled out this morning," announced Richard Chun, the silver-haired CFO who'd been with the company since its early days, his voice tight with frustration. They're citing concerns about leadership instability, about your commitment. Marcus nodded calmly, though he felt the weight of 12 pairs of eyes studying him for cracks, for weakness, for any sign that he was breaking under the pressure. I understand their concerns. Do you? Margaret Kim, the youngest board member and usually his strongest ally, leaned forward with barely contained frustration. Because frankly, Marcus, none of us understand what's happening. You've missed 3 major calls, postponed the Tokyo follow-up indefinitely, and now this. Your assistant says you're unavailable most afternoons and completely unreachable after 6 p.m. What's going on? The old Marcus would have launched into damage control mode immediately, would have reassured them with projections and timelines and promises to get back on track. Would have done whatever it took to keep the empire running smoothly. Instead, he found himself thinking about Liam's laugh, a sound he'd discovered just yesterday when he'd made exaggerated faces during a diaper change, pure joy that had made his heart feel too big for his chest. There have been some personal developments, Marcus said carefully, choosing his words. Significant ones. Personal developments? Richard's voice carried the edge of a man who'd built his entire career on the assumption that personal lives stayed personal, that they didn't interfere with business. Marcus, you're the CEO of a billion-dollar company. We don't have the luxury of personal developments affecting our operations. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. 6 months ago, he would have agreed completely, would have said the exact same thing. Personal complications were obstacles to be managed, minimized, controlled, not priorities to be honored. But sitting in this room, listening to concerns about market confidence and investor relations, all he could think about was the fact that Emma was dealing with Liam's first cold alone while he sat here defending choices that finally, for the first time in his life, felt absolutely right. I need to propose something, Marcus said, cutting through the murmur of worried conversations that had started around the table. I'm transitioning to a consulting role, effective immediately. Richard will step up as acting CEO, while we search for a permanent replacement. The silence that followed was deafening, like the air had been sucked out of the room. You're quitting. Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper, disbelief written across her face. I'm choosing differently, Marcus corrected, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. This company will thrive without me, it was designed to. But there are things in my life that can't thrive without my attention, that need me specifically, and I've already lost too much time. An hour later, Marcus walked out of his own building for what might be the last time as its CEO. The autumn Seattle air felt different somehow, sharper, more real than the climate-controlled environment he'd been living in for years, breathing recycled air and artificial light. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Liam's fever broke. He's asking for you. Well, more like dada while looking at the door, but I'm translating. Asking for him. For words that meant more than any contract he'd ever signed, any deal he'd ever closed, any empire he'd ever built. He found Emma in the kitchen of her small apartment, sterilizing bottles while Liam napped in his bouncer nearby, the picture of domestic normalcy that felt more valuable than gold. She looked up when Marcus entered, and he saw relief in her eyes that she didn't try to hide anymore. How did it go? She asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to know the answer. I resigned. Emma's hand stilled on the bottle she'd been washing, soap suds dripping back into the sink. Marcus, no. You can't just. I didn't just do anything. He crossed to where Liam was sleeping, reaching down to brush a gentle finger across his son's forehead, checking for fever out of instinct now. I made a choice I should have made years ago. A choice I'm finally brave enough to make. But your company, your career, will survive. Marcus straightened, meeting her gaze directly, unflinching. Companies always survive, Emma. But we don't get another chance at this, at him being small, at being the father he deserves from the very beginning. Emma dried her hands slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, processing. This isn't some grand gesture to win me back, is it? Because Liam and I, we're not a prize to be won through dramatic sacrifices, Marcus. The directness of her question caught him off guard, but he appreciated it. Emma had never been afraid to ask the hard questions, even when the answers might hurt, even when the truth was complicated. No, Marcus said simply, honestly. This is about becoming the man I want to be. Not proving anything to anyone else, not even to you. She studied his face, searching for something, doubt perhaps, or the kind of restless energy that had always driven him away from domestic moments in the past, that had made him check his phone during dinner and take calls during movies. "You don't know what you're signing up for," she said finally, voice soft with warning. "This isn't glamorous, Marcus. Most days are repetitive and exhausting and boring. Liam will have good days and terrible days, and on the terrible days, he won't care that you gave up a billion-dollar empire to be here." "I'm counting on it," Marcus replied, voice steady. "I've spent my whole adult life being valued for what I could produce, what I could achieve, what I could deliver. I want to matter to someone just because I show up, just because I'm his father." Something shifted in Emma's expression, a guard dropping that he hadn't even fully realized was there. "He woke up 3 times last night asking for Dada," she said quietly, emotion making her voice thick. "Well, it was more like da-da-da. But he was definitely looking toward the door, looking for you." Marcus felt his breath catch, felt tears he hadn't cried in years threatening to fall. "He's never done that for anyone else." For a moment they stood in the simple kitchen. The weight of the choice Marcus had made settling between them like something tangible and precious. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, continued demanding and taking and consuming. But inside Emma's apartment, time moved according to different rules, gentler ones. "Marcus," Emma said, her voice softer than he'd heard it in years. "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but would you consider letting me help more? Not just with money or supplies, but with the real things, the hard things. Night feedings, doctor appointments, all of it, everything." She was quiet for so long that Marcus began to worry he'd overstepped, pushed too hard, asked for too much too soon. But when she finally spoke, her voice carried a cautious hope that made his chest tighten. "He has a pediatrician appointment next Tuesday at 2 p.m., she said carefully. "If you want to come, if you're serious about this, I'd really like that." It was such a small thing, an invitation to a routine medical appointment, nothing dramatic or life-changing. But as Marcus nodded his acceptance, he realized that the most important negotiations of his life weren't happening in boardrooms anymore. They were happening in quiet kitchens, measured not in millions of dollars but in moments of trust offered carefully, one at a time, building something that might actually last. But their peace was about to be shattered by a threat Marcus never saw coming. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail while Marcus was feeding Liam breakfast, and Emma was getting ready for her first job interview in over a year. The envelope bore the letterhead of Morrison & Associates, one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms, and Marcus's hands went cold as he read the contents, as the words sank in like poison. Custody petition. Legal guardianship. Paternal rights being challenged. Richard Chun, Marcus's former CFO and the board member who had taken his resignation most personally, was making a move that went far beyond corporate revenge, far beyond professional disagreement. The petition, filed by Richard's daughter Sarah, who specialized in parental rights cases, claimed that Marcus had abandoned his son for the first 4 months of his life, and had only recently inserted himself into Liam's care out of guilt, not genuine commitment. The legal documents painted a picture of an unstable father who had walked away from both his child and his financial responsibilities, only to return when it was convenient, attempting to disrupt Liam's established routine with his mother, putting his own needs above the child's welfare. The minor child would be best served by limiting the biological father's contact to supervised visitation until such time as a pattern of consistent, long-term commitment can be established. Marcus's vision blurred as he read the clinical language that reduced his love for Liam to a legal liability, that turned his choice to be present into evidence of instability. Richard was using Sarah's expertise to challenge his parental rights, claiming that someone who had abandoned his responsibilities as CEO could not be trusted with the responsibility of fatherhood, that his judgment was fundamentally flawed. "Marcus!" Emma's voice came from the bedroom doorway, and he realized he'd been staring at the papers for several minutes while Liam grew increasingly impatient in his high chair, banging his sippy cup for attention. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus looked up at her, dressed for her interview in a simple black dress that made her look professional and confident, and ready to reclaim a piece of herself she'd set aside for motherhood. She was glowing with quiet excitement, and he was about to destroy it all. "We need to sit down," he said quietly, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. Tell me in the comments what you would do in this situation. And if you've dealt with something similar, share your story. You're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. Emma's response to the custody threat would change everything. Would she stand by Marcus, or would fear make her push him away? The final part will reveal how love truly conquers all. Relentless pace, continued demanding and taking and consuming. But inside Emma's apartment, Emma's face went pale as she read the legal documents. Her hands trembling slightly as she processed each calculated word. Her voice softer than he'd heard it in constructed argument. I know I don't have the right to ask this, but would you consider letting me help more? She whispered. Not just reading money or supplies, but with the real things, hoping the words would somehow change. Night feedings would somehow be less devastating. All of it, everything. You're his father. She was quiet for so long that Marcus began to worry he'd overstepped. You've been here every single day for months, Marcus. Asked for too much too soon. Apparently that doesn't matter. But when she finally someone wants to challenge it, her voice carried a cautious hope that made his chest tighten. His voice rough with anger and fear. He has a pediatrician appointment next Tuesday. Richard has connections throughout the Seattle legal system. If you want to come, his daughter knows exactly how to make this process as difficult and painful as possible. It was such a small thing. Emma was quiet for a long moment, to a routine studying the papers with the careful attention dramatic she gave to anything that threatened Liam's well-being. But as Marcus nodded his acceptance, her mind working through he realized that the most important negotiations of his life weren't happening in boardrooms anymore. Voice steadier than they were happening in quiet kitchens. They want to prove I'm not in millions of dollars, but in moments of trust, running his hands through his hair one at a time, building something that might actually away from my company shows I can't be trusted to be shattered by a threat Marcus never saw my choice to prioritize. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, that I'm impulsive delivered and by certified mail while that Marcus was feeding just like I abandoned the business. And Emma was getting ready for her first job interview in over a year. Fiercely, protective instinct the letterhead of Morrison and Associates. You chose us, one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms, to be present, and Marcus's hands went cold as he read the contents. I chose you after missing the first 4 months of his life because I was too busy to answer my phone. Legal guardianship. Paternal rights carrying finally spilling out. Richard Chun, and now Marcus's that choice former is being used CFO against and the board member who had taken his resignation most personally. Emma set the papers was making aside a move that went far beyond corporate revenge, gripping them tightly, far beyond professional disagreement. Here now. The petition, filed by Richard's daughter Sarah, Emma, who specialized in parental rights cases, emotions claimed that Marcus had abandoned his son for the first 4 months of his life. Richard has money, connections, and a compelling narrative about absent fathers who show up only when it's convenient. The legal documents painted a picture of an unstable father who had walked away from both his child and his financial responsibilities, only to return when I called when we needed you, attempting to disrupt Liam's established routine when Liam was sick, when I was putting his own needs above the child's welfare. Here through sleepless the minor child would be best served by limiting the biological father's contact to supervised visitation until such time as a pattern of consistent, to a judge who sees a billionaire who walked away from his responsibilities. Marcus's vision blurred as he read the clinical language that reduced his love for Liam to a legal liability. Pacing to the window where morning light streamed to evidence of instability. Illuminating the dust Richard was dancing in Sarah's the air expertise to challenge his parental rights. Marcus watched her process claiming that someone who had abandoned the legal fees that could drain their resources could not be trusted with the responsibility of his development. That his judgment was fundamentally flawed, visits replacing the natural family rhythm. Emma's voice came from the bedroom doorway. There's something else. And he realized he'd been staring at the papers for several minutes while Liam grew increasingly impatient in his high chair. Emma turned back to him, his sippy bracing cup for herself for another blow. What's wrong? And he saw her physically prepare for more bad news. Marcus looked up at her. People have been investigating her interview in a simple black dress that made her look professional and confident and ready to reclaim my finances, my properties, my previous relationships, everything. She was glowing with quiet excitement. The penthouse, the cars, the lifestyle I had before Liam. We need to sit down. Argue that I can't provide a stable, consistent home environment to his own because I'm used to living without restrictions or responsibilities. Situation that I'm fundamentally unsuited to the routine and sacrifice parenthood requires. You're not alone. That's not who you are anymore. For more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. But it's Emma's response to the custody threat would change everything. Would she stand by documentation to prove fear make her push him away? Photos from social events, the final articles about my how love truly conquers all. Evidence of every choice I made that put work before everything else, before relationships, before basic human connection. Emma sank back onto the couch, the weight of the situation finally hitting her fully, threatening to crush them both. What do we do? Marcus had been dreading this question because he already knew one answer. Had known it from the moment he'd read the petition. There was one way to end this fight quickly, one strategy that would protect Liam from a prolonged legal battle and give Emma the peace she desperately deserved. I could withdraw my paternity claim, he said quietly, each word painful. Step back. Let you raise Liam without the legal complications my presence creates, without the risk of losing in court. No. Emma's response was immediate and fierce, more forceful than he'd ever heard her. Absolutely not. Emma, think about it rationally. Marcus tried to reason, tried to make her see the logic. Richard wins either way if we fight this. Even if we prove I'm a good father, the process will take months, cost thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. It'll put Liam in the middle of a legal war that could traumatize all of us. If you step back, you prove their point, Emma interrupted, her green eyes flashing with an anger and determination he'd never seen directed at him. You prove that when things get difficult, you choose the easy way out. You prove that you're exactly who they say you are. This isn't about taking the easy way out. Then what is it about? Emma demanded, standing to face him directly. Protecting us from what? From having a father who loves us enough to fight for us? From having someone who shows up even when it's hard? Marcus stared at her, surprised by the vehemence in her voice, by the absolute conviction blazing in her eyes. Emma, I'm trying to. Do you remember what you told me when Liam was in the hospital? Emma asked, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. You said you wanted to be there for the hard moments, not just the good ones. You said you wanted to matter to someone just because you showed up. Emma's face went pale as she read the legal documents, her hands trembling slightly as she processed each calculated word, each carefully constructed argument designed to tear their family apart. They can't do this, she whispered, reading the petition for a second time as if hoping the words would somehow change, would somehow be less devastating. You're his father. You're on his birth certificate. You've been here every single day for months, Marcus. Apparently that doesn't matter legally if someone wants to challenge it, Marcus said, his voice rough with anger and fear he couldn't quite control. Richard has connections throughout the Seattle legal system, and his daughter knows exactly how to make this process as difficult and painful as possible. Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers with the careful attention she gave to anything that threatened Liam's well-being, her mind working through possibilities and consequences. What do they want? She asked finally, voice steadier than he expected. They want to prove I'm unreliable, Marcus said, running his hands through his hair in agitation. That walking away from my company shows I can't be trusted with long-term commitments. They're painting my choice to prioritize Liam as evidence that I'm impulsive and unstable, that I'll abandon him just like I abandoned the business. But that's insane, Emma said fiercely, protective instinct blazing in her eyes. You chose us. You chose to be here, to be present, to be a father. I chose you after missing the first 4 months of his life because I was too busy to answer my phone, Marcus said quietly, the guilt he'd been carrying finally spilling out. And now that choice is being used against me, twisted into something ugly. Emma set the papers aside and reached for Marcus's hands, gripping them tightly. But you're here now. That has to count for something. Clara, Emma, Marcus caught himself, emotions overwhelming his usual precision. They could win. Richard has money, connections, and a compelling narrative about absent fathers who show up only when it's convenient, who can't be trusted. But you didn't show up when it was convenient, Emma said with fierce conviction that took his breath away. You showed up when I called, when we needed you. You stayed when things got hard, when Liam was sick, when I was falling apart. You've been here through sleepless nights and hospital emergencies and teething tantrums. That's not convenience, Marcus. That's love. Try explaining that to a judge who sees a billionaire who walked away from his responsibilities and then tried to buy his way back into his child's life. Emma stood abruptly, pacing to the window where morning light streamed through, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny stars. Marcus watched her process the implications, the legal fees that could drain their resources, the stress on Liam that could affect his development, the possibility of supervised visits replacing the natural family rhythm they'd worked so hard to build. There's something else, Marcus said, the words feeling like shards of glass cutting his throat. Emma turned back to him, bracing herself for another blow, and he saw her physically prepare for more bad news. Richard's people have been investigating me, Marcus said, jaw tightening with barely controlled anger. My finances, my properties, my previous relationships, everything. They know about the penthouse, the cars, the lifestyle I had before Liam. They're going to argue that I can't provide a stable, consistent home environment Because I'm used to living without restrictions or responsibilities, that I'm fundamentally unsuited to the routine and sacrifice parenthood requires. That's not who you are anymore, Emma said, but her voice wavered slightly. But it's who I was, Marcus admitted, the truth of it heavy. And they have documentation to prove it. Photos from social events, articles about my business practices, evidence of every choice I made that put work before everything else, before relationships, before basic human connection. Emma sank back onto the couch, the weight of the situation finally hitting her fully, threatening to crush them both. What do we do? Marcus had been dreading this question because he already knew one answer. Had known it from the moment he'd read the petition. There was one way to end this fight quickly. One strategy that would protect Liam from a prolonged legal battle and give Emma the peace she desperately deserved. I could withdraw my paternity claim, he said quietly, each word painful. Step back. Let you raise Liam without the legal complications my presence creates, without the risk of losing in court. No. Emma's response was immediate and fierce, more forceful than he'd ever heard her. Absolutely not. Emma, think about it rationally. Marcus tried to reason, tried to make her see the logic. Richard wins either way if we fight this. Even if we prove I'm a good father, the process will take months, cost thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. It'll put Liam in the middle of a legal war that could traumatize all of us. If you step back, you prove their point, Emma interrupted, her green eyes flashing with an anger and determination he'd never seen directed at him. You prove that when things get difficult, you choose the easy way out. You prove that you're exactly who they say you are. This isn't about taking the easy way out. Then what is it about? Emma demanded, standing to face him directly. Protecting us from what? From having a father who loves us enough to fight for us? From having someone who shows up, even when it's hard? Marcus stared at her, surprised by the vehemence in her voice, by the absolute conviction blazing in her eyes. Emma, I'm trying to. Do you remember what you told me when Liam was in the hospital? Emma asked, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. You said you wanted to be there for the hard moments, not just the good ones. You said you wanted to matter to someone just because you showed up. This is different. This is exactly the same, Emma interrupted, moving closer and taking his face in her hands in a gesture that was both tender and demanding. This is the moment that defines who you really are, Marcus. Not the man you were before Liam, not the CEO who chose work over love, but the father who chooses to fight for his son, even when the odds are stacked against him, even when it would be easier to walk away. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her faith in him, the trust she was placing in his ability to be better than he'd been before. What if we lose? He whispered, voicing his deepest fear. What if all this fighting just makes things worse? What if we win? Emma countered, her thumbs brushing across his cheekbones. What if we stand up to Richard Chan and his daughter and everyone else who thinks they can decide what kind of family we're allowed to be, and we win? What if we show Liam that some things are worth fighting for? From his spot on the floor, Liam looked up at them with those serious hazel eyes and clapped his hands together as if applauding their decision, as if he understood on some deep level that his future was being decided in this moment. The gesture was so perfectly timed, so innocently joyful, that both Emma and Marcus laughed despite the tension crackling in the air, despite the fear threatening to overwhelm them. Okay, Marcus said, pulling Emma into his arms while Liam babbled his approval from the floor. We fight. Together. Together, Emma echoed, and in that word was everything. All the hope and fear and determination that would carry them through what came next. The legal battle lasted 18 months. 18 months of depositions and court appearances and mounting legal fees that tested them in ways they never imagined. But through it all, Marcus showed up. Every doctor's appointment, every sleepless night, every moment Liam needed him. Richard's lawyers tried to paint him as unreliable, but the evidence told a different story. Months of pediatrician visits with both parents present. Family photos documenting everyday moments. Testimony from Emma about Marcus's unwavering commitment. About the way he'd learned to be not just a father but a partner. And in the end, the judge saw what Richard's money and connections couldn't obscure. A man who had made mistakes but was willing to spend the rest of his life making them right. A father who chose presence over profit, love over legacy. 2 years after that first terrifying phone call, Marcus stood in the kitchen of the house they'd chosen together in Queen Anne, watching through the window as 2.5-year-old Liam played in their small backyard. The legal battle was over, won decisively, but the real victory was quieter. The life they'd built in the aftermath. Emma emerged from the bedroom and Marcus smiled as she moved into his arms, her hand unconsciously moving to her stomach where their second child was growing, making its presence known with increasing frequency. "He's going to want to push the swing higher," Marcus observed, watching Liam through the window. "He gets that from you," Emma laughed. "The stubborn refusal to accept limitations." "I learned it from his mother," Marcus replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The woman who refused to let me give up when it would have been easier." "I have something to show you," Marcus said, producing his phone. Emma raised an eyebrow, but took the phone and read the email displayed there. Her eyes widened, tears gathering as she processed the words. "The gallery wants to feature 3 of my pieces," she whispered, hardly believing it. "Marcus, this is everything you deserve," he finished. "You're an incredible artist, Emma. The world should see what I get to see every day." From outside came Liam's voice, demanding attention with all the imperious certainty of a toddler who expected immediate response. "Up, Daddy." Marcus lifted him easily when they went outside, and Emma watched as Liam settled against his father's chest with the casual comfort of a child who had never known anything but love and security, who would grow up knowing his father had fought for the right to be present in his life. "Are you going to tell him?" Marcus asked quietly, nodding toward Emma's still flat stomach. "About the baby?" "Tell him what?" Emma asked innocently, though her smile gave her away. "That he's going to be a big brother." Liam looked between them with sharp toddler perception, sensing important conversation. "Baby?" he asked hopefully, the word one of his favorites since visiting Emma's friend whose infant daughter fascinated him endlessly. "Yes, sweetheart," Emma said, reaching out to smooth Liam's dark hair with infinite tenderness. "Mama has a baby in her tummy. You're going to be a big brother." Liam considered this information with the seriousness he brought to all major announcements. "Baby brother," he declared with satisfaction, as if he'd personally arranged this development. "Or sister," Emma corrected gently, smiling. "Baby," Liam repeated firmly, having apparently decided that specific details were less important than the general concept. That evening, after Liam was asleep surrounded by the stuffed animals that had accumulated over 2 years of birthdays and holidays and spontaneous treats, Marcus and Emma sat together on their front porch, watching Seattle's lights twinkle in the distance like earthbound stars. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't called you that night?" Emma asked, her head resting on Marcus's shoulder in perfect contentment. "Every day," Marcus admitted, his arm tightening around her. "And every day I'm grateful you were brave enough to reach out, even when you had every reason not to trust me, when I'd given you nothing but reasons to expect disappointment." "I was terrified," Emma confessed, voice soft with memory. "Not just of being a single mother, but of hoping you changed when everything in my experience suggested people don't really change, that you just disappoint me again." "Do you still think that? That people don't change?" Emma was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I think people don't change unless they want to badly enough to do the hard work of becoming someone different," she said slowly. "And I think love, real love, makes that work feel worth it, makes the sacrifice feel less like loss and more like gain." Marcus turned to look at her, seeing in her eyes the woman she'd become through motherhood and struggle, and learning to trust again, seeing the future they were building together. "Emma Rodriguez," he said quietly, "will you marry me?" The question was so simply asked, so naturally integrated into their conversation, that for a moment Emma thought she'd misheard, that her tired brain was playing tricks. "What? Will you marry me?" Marcus repeated, producing a small velvet box from his pocket that caught the porch light. "I know we've never talked about marriage, and I know we don't need it to be a family, we already are one. But I want everyone to know that I choose you, that every day for the rest of my life I choose you and Liam, and this baby we're expecting and whatever comes after that." Emma looked down at the ring, a simple solitaire that caught the light and sparkled with promise, and felt her heart expand in a way she hadn't known was possible, growing to make room for even more love. "Marcus Sterling," she said, happy tears spilling over despite her efforts to maintain composure. Are you proposing to me on our front porch while our son sleeps upstairs and our second child grows inside me? Is that a problem? Marcus asked, suddenly uncertain. It's perfect, Emma said, reaching for the ring with trembling fingers, her voice thick with emotion. Everything about this is absolutely perfect. As Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, Emma thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago, exhausted and alone and terrified of hoping for more than she could provide on her own, convinced she'd have to do everything herself forever. That woman could never have imagined this life, this love, this quiet joy that came from choosing each other every single day, through legal battles and sleepless nights and the beautiful chaos of building a family. So that's a yes? Marcus asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. That's a yes to everything, Emma replied, kissing him under the Seattle stars while their son slept peacefully inside the home they'd built together. To marriage, to family, to whatever comes next, to all of it. And as they sat together on their front porch, planning a future that stretched out before them full of possibility and love, and the beautiful complexity of lives intertwined by choice rather than chance, Emma realized something profound. The best love stories weren't about perfect people finding each other in some fairy tale moment. They were about imperfect people choosing to become better together, choosing to fight for each other when it would be easier to walk away, choosing love even when, especially when, it required sacrifice. One ordinary, extraordinary day at a time. From inside the house came a small sound, Liam stirring in his sleep, and both Emma and Marcus smiled, knowing that in a few hours they'd be up again, navigating the beautiful chaos of parenthood together. But for now, they sat in the quiet evening, two people who'd found their way back to each other through the most unexpected circumstances, who'd built something real and lasting from the ashes of what they'd lost. And as Marcus held Emma close, her ring catching starlight, their son sleeping peacefully, their second child growing strong, he understood finally what success actually looked like. Not the billions in the bank or the empire he'd built or the deals he'd closed. But this quiet moment, this choice to be present, this family built on love fierce enough to fight for, brave enough to believe in, strong enough to last. This was everything.